At his sister's lakeside rehearsal, finance professional Ryan senses a crack in the picture-perfect night. A stranger in a dark suit, a furtive text, a mother who won't quite meet his eyes when an anonymous message urges him toward the water he must choose. Protect the day or face the truth that could break them. I still remember the sun sinking low as I stepped into the banquet hall for my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner, and how the air felt oddly thick that evening, as though something unseen was hanging over everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm a 30-something professional working in finance in a medium-sized city by the Lakeshore. My sister Emma had been engaged for more than a year, and the planning for the wedding was supposed to be the big family event that finally brought us all together. Mom and Dad divorced when I was in college, and ever since the split, I've always carried a subtle hope that something like this might pull the family tighter again. So when the invitation to the rehearsal dinner arrived, I told myself this was the moment. I walked through the doors of the hall a little early so I could greet Dad first. He was seated at one of the long tables by a window, casting the fading light of the afternoon over his pale shirt. He looked the way I remembered him. A little distant, polite, reserved, as though still the same man who didn't quite know how to fill the silence after the divorce. I sat next to him, offered him a drink, asked how he was doing, and he gave that typical dad response, "I'm fine, Ryan," and an awkward smile. I tried to lighten the mood by pointing out how nice the event looked, how the lights were strung up just right, crisp linens on the tables, all the superficial commentary I could muster. He nodded. Then I went across the table with drink in hand to greet Mom, who was already at the head table with my sister and her fiancé. She turned toward me, held back a small smile. Too small, I thought. Her eyes flickered for a moment to someone behind me, someone I didn't yet know. I didn't dwell on it. I sat briefly, asked how she was, and she said she was looking forward to the evening. But there was something in the way she spoke, the pause before she answered, the small hesitation as to what she meant when she said, "Tonight will be nice." That made me shift slightly in my seat. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, it was just a family event, a celebration. My little sister getting married. We were supposed to be happy. The laughter started as other guests poured in, colleagues of Emma's fiancé, friends from high school, and Dad politely got up to say hello to some of Emma's old friends. I drifted toward the drinks table to refresh my drink and paused when I noticed Mom speaking quietly with a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize. He had the easy confidence of someone used to power and had his hand briefly on Mom's shoulder in a way that made me uncomfortable, though I tried to shrug it off as normal adult greeting. For a moment I caught a flash of the man's badge. Something corporate worn inside his jacket, but I was too far to be sure. I pulled myself back from that uneasy feeling of what's going on and smiled at a passing guest. Then I walked back to Dad's seat and caught a glimpse of him glancing over at Mom and the suited man. His expression didn't change, but his eyes stayed locked just for a second longer than one would expect. My heart pricked. The night moved on. Speeches, toasts, clinking glasses, the soft hum of conversation. At one point Emma asked me to come over and stand next to her because she was being introduced to a large group of her fiancé's colleagues. I walked over and felt the weight of the moment. That this was her night, the threshold of a new life, and yet something in the back of my mind refused to quiet. A glimmer as though a small crack had formed in the carefully painted picture of family happiness. Dad stood to make a toast. He raised his glass, his voice steady but low, and said something about love and new beginnings, and how proud he was of his daughter, and how he welcomed her new life. He paused. My sister's fiancé gave her a quick look, and she smiled broadly. After the toast, someone brought out the rehearsal dinner cake, and laughter trickled again. Photos were taken, people exchanged kind words. I stood by Mom briefly and noticed her phone screen illuminated with a text message. The preview read something like, "Sorry about last week. See you later tonight." I blinked. Did I imagine that preview? I saw her tap yes, and a small look of relief passed across her face when she did. I forced my lips into a smile, excused myself, and stepped outside for a breath of autumn air. The crisp wind filled my lungs, and I tried to steady my racing thoughts. How could I be seeing this at a rehearsal dinner for my sister's wedding? I told myself maybe it was nothing at all. Maybe I was misreading a glimpse. Maybe I was projecting. But something had changed in me that evening. I realized that the simple hope I had held onto, of us all sitting together as a unified family, might be more fragile than I ever allowed myself to believe. I took a deep breath as I looked back toward the illuminated hall through the glass doors, and I wondered what I would do next. The morning after the rehearsal dinner began quietly enough, yet something in me would not settle. I kept replaying small moments from the night before like a record skipping on one strange note. The way Mom had smiled too politely when Dad gave his toast, or the way she had kept glancing toward that man in the dark suit every time the room shifted and laughter rose. My sister Emma was radiant that morning, glowing with the kind of excitement only a bride-to-be can carry, and I didn't want to dampen it with my restless thoughts. So I offered to help with last-minute errands to stay busy and keep my mind off what I'd seen. We spent the early hours picking up decorations from the rental shop and dropping off floral arrangements at the venue. Everything seemed to be coming together perfectly, yet every time my phone vibrated I half expected a message from Mom or Dad asking if we could talk. Nothing came. Around noon we met for lunch at a small cafe near the Lakeshore. Emma sat across from me, scrolling through her phone, checking off lists for seating charts and catering schedules while humming quietly under her breath. She looked so calm that I found myself almost jealous of her peace. Then she looked up and asked if I was okay. Apparently I had been staring at nothing for several minutes. I told her I was fine, just tired from the long week of preparations, but she didn't quite believe me. She tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when we were kids whenever she knew I was hiding something. I told her that the rehearsal dinner had gone well and that she should be proud of how smoothly she handled everything. She smiled and said that it had felt strange seeing Mom and Dad in the same room after all these years. When she said that, my stomach tightened again. She didn't say anything about the suited man though, so I chose not to either. After lunch I drove home to change, and as I passed the old neighborhood where we grew up I couldn't help but think back to the nights when Mom and Dad used to fight in the kitchen when they thought we were asleep. Their voices would rise muffled through the walls, and then silence would follow for hours. I remember Dad sleeping on the couch the next morning and Mom pretending nothing had happened. It was the same pattern that eventually broke them apart and made every family gathering feel like walking through a field of hidden glass. Maybe last night had only felt strange because old memories were resurfacing, I told myself. Maybe that was all. That afternoon I stopped by Dad's apartment to drop off a small gift I'd bought him. A tie clip engraved with the wedding date, so he'd have something subtle yet meaningful to wear. When I handed it to him, he smiled faintly, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. The living room was tidy, though the air felt still like a place where someone spent a lot of time alone. He offered coffee and we sat quietly for a while until he said he wanted to ask me something. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He just stared at the wall across from him where an old family photo still hung from before the divorce. He asked if Mom seemed different to me lately. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering and he noticed. I said she seemed happy about the wedding and left it at that. He nodded slowly as though expecting more. Then he said he had seen her leave the hall last night for almost half an hour and come back with that man from her company. He said he wasn't sure if he was reading too much into it, but something about the way they stood near the parking lot made him uneasy. I wanted to tell him I'd seen it too, yet part of me didn't want to fan a flame that might already be burning out of control. Instead I told him it was probably business talk or something harmless. He gave a small laugh that sounded more like a sigh and said he hoped I was right. I stayed a little longer helping him iron his shirt for the ceremony and then left. On my drive back I tried to shake off the unease, but every traffic light seemed to last longer than usual, giving my mind too much room to wander. When I reached my apartment I checked my phone and noticed a missed call from an unknown number, followed by a short text that simply read, "We should talk soon about your mother." My chest tightened as I read it again and again. There was no name attached, no clue who had sent it. I dialed the number, but it went straight to voicemail. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity always wins with me. I sent a reply asking who it was. Minutes later another message came in. "You don't know me, but I think your father deserves the truth before the wedding tomorrow." My pulse quickened as I read those words. I called again, but still no answer. Only silence and the faint hum of the city outside my window. I stood there staring at the screen, realizing that something bigger was unfolding around me and I had no idea how to stop it. The rehearsal dinner had been strange enough, but now it felt like I was standing on the edge of a secret about to come loose. I placed the phone face down on the table and sat on the couch listening to the distant sound of a passing train. Whatever this message meant, I knew one thing for sure. The wedding tomorrow would not be as simple as everyone hoped. I woke the next morning before dawn and sat at the edge of the bed staring at the dim light creeping through the blinds while the city outside still slept beneath a faint mist that made the street lamps look like soft ghosts. My phone lay on the nightstand and I kept glancing at it, waiting for another message that never came. The unknown number had gone silent after that last text. I tried to convince myself it was some sort of prank, maybe a wrong number, maybe a coincidence, but deep down I knew better. The timing was too precise. Whoever sent that message knew about the wedding, knew about my family, and knew enough to hint that my father was owed some truth. I showered, dressed, and made coffee, though I barely touched it. My stomach felt tight, the kind of nervous tension that comes when something bad is hovering in the background just out of reach. Around 7, I finally gathered enough nerve to call Mom. I told myself I only wanted to check if she was awake and ready for the big day, but I suppose I was really listening for something in her voice, something that might confirm my growing suspicion. She answered cheerfully, too cheerfully, in that high tone she used whenever she was trying to smooth over stress. She said she had a few errands to run before heading to the venue and that she would see me there. Her tone carried no hint of worry or guilt, just brisk excitement. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that suited man from the rehearsal dinner. The morning passed slowly. I ironed my shirt again, though it was already neat, checked the gift I had prepared for Emma, and drove toward the lakeside venue where the ceremony would be held. The road wound along the water, glimmering under early sun, and I tried to focus on the beauty of it all. Today was supposed to be about celebration, about beginnings, not suspicion. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to that text message, sitting unread now in my phone history like a pebble caught in my shoe. When I arrived, the venue was already buzzing with activity. Florists arranging centerpieces, photographers unpacking gear, Emma's friends fluttering about like bright birds in matching dresses. I found Emma in the dressing suite, surrounded by makeup artists and laughter. She looked radiant, almost ethereal, her hair pinned with small pearl clips and her face glowing with calm joy. Seeing her like that grounded me for a moment. Whatever was happening between our parents was their problem, not hers. I promised myself I wouldn't let anything ruin her day. Still, I noticed that Mom wasn't in the room. I asked one of the bridesmaids, who said Mom had stepped outside to take a phone call about 20 minutes ago. My pulse quickened, though I forced a smile and pretended to be calm. I excused myself and wandered through the corridor lined with white drapes until I reached the garden terrace. There she was, near the far end of the path, half hidden by the hedge, her back to me, her phone pressed to her ear. I couldn't hear the words, but her posture told enough. Tense shoulders, slight tilt of her head downward, a gesture she used when she was pleading or explaining something uncomfortable. After a moment she turned slightly, and I saw the man from last night standing beside her. He wasn't dressed for a wedding. He wore the same kind of dark business suit and looked completely out of place among the flowers and ribbon chairs. I stepped back before they could see me, my heart thudding so loud I could feel it in my throat. I didn't want to eavesdrop, yet I couldn't move. They spoke quietly, then she reached out, touched his arm quickly, and he stepped closer. It wasn't romantic exactly, but it was intimate in that quiet, private way that belongs to people who share secrets. A moment later she turned and walked briskly back toward the building, and he lingered for a few seconds before heading toward the parking lot. I ducked inside through a side door before she saw me. Inside the hallway I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breath. There was no denying it anymore, something was happening between Mom and that man. Whether it was an affair or some business entanglement, I didn't know, but the message on my phone echoed louder than ever. Your father deserves the truth. An hour later guests began arriving. Music drifted from the courtyard, the smell of fresh flowers mixed with cologne and champagne, and everything looked picture perfect. Dad arrived wearing the tie clip I'd given him, which made me oddly proud. He looked calm, though there was a stiffness in his smile, as if he too sensed some imbalance in the day. When he asked if I had seen Mom yet, I lied and said she was helping Emma with last-minute details. As the ceremony began, I sat near the front with family. Emma walked down the aisle radiant and trembling with joy, while her fiancé waited at the altar grinning so wide it almost looked painful. I wanted to lose myself in that moment, to let the music and the vows drown out everything else, but my eyes drifted toward the back row where Mom sat alone, glancing repeatedly at her phone. Each time it lit up, she would tilt it slightly away as though hiding the screen. My chest tightened again. After the ceremony, everyone poured out into the open lawn where waiters began serving champagne and laughter spilled like sunlight. I tried to stay close to Dad, but he wandered off to talk with distant relatives, leaving me standing near the buffet. That was when my phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. This time the message was longer. It said, "He's here at the wedding. If you want proof, step outside near the lake behind the gazebo. Do it before your father does." I felt my knees weaken slightly. I looked around trying to see if anyone was watching me. Everyone seemed distracted with photographs and music. I slipped away quietly down the path leading to the back of the venue where the water shimmered in the late afternoon light. The air smelled faintly of pine and champagne. I rounded the corner of the gazebo and froze. There stood the suited man again, holding his phone pressed to his ear, pacing slowly by the water. I couldn't hear the words, but his tone was urgent, almost pleading. And then I saw her, Mom, emerge from the trees, walking quickly toward him. My breath caught in my throat. She said something sharp, and he responded by gesturing toward the hall. For a brief instant, her face turned in my direction, though I was half hidden by the corner. The expression on her face wasn't guilt exactly, but fear. The kind that comes when someone realizes they've run out of places to hide. Before I could decide whether to confront them, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Dad walking down the path, following the same direction I had come. He hadn't noticed me yet. His eyes were fixed ahead on the two figures by the water. I knew that in another few seconds, he would see them, and whatever secret they had been keeping would explode into the open right here on Emma's wedding day. I had to choose whether to stop him or let him walk straight into it. I stood frozen on the gravel path, the sunlight flickering through the leaves, while the sound of soft music from the reception floated faintly across the water. Dad was still walking toward the lake, his stride steady, his eyes locked ahead on the figures by the waterline. Every instinct in me wanted to rush forward and block his path to stop him before he saw what I had just seen, but my body would not move. It was as though the weight of every unspoken tension in our family had congealed into that single moment, holding me still like a pinned insect. Mom and the suited man were standing close enough now that I could make out fragments of their voices carried by the breeze. She was pleading with him in a low, urgent tone while he kept shaking his head. Then the man slipped his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope which he extended toward her. For a second she refused to take it, but he insisted, pushing it gently into her hands. I could see the tremor in her fingers as she finally accepted it and tucked it into her small clutch purse. Dad took another step forward. The distance between them closed until there was no more than a few yards. He called her name. It was not loud, but the way he said it made me flinch. She turned, startled eyes wide, mouth open, as if she had been caught in the middle of a crime. The man turned too, clearly realizing who Dad was, and looked ready to retreat, but it was too late. The silence that followed was so deep that even the music from the reception seemed to fade. I walked quickly toward them, desperate to reach before words turned to something worse. Dad's voice was quiet but sharp as broken glass when he asked what was going on. Mom said something about work, about an urgent matter that could not wait, and that the man was only a colleague dropping off documents. But the man's face betrayed a different story. His eyes darted from her to Dad, then to me and back again. He looked like someone caught between guilt and panic. Dad asked again what was in the envelope. She said it was nothing that concerned him, but her voice cracked on the last word. That was when the man muttered an apology under his breath, something about being sorry for how things had turned out, and turned to leave. Dad stepped sideways, blocking his path, and told him to explain himself. The man hesitated, looked at Mom one last time, and then said quietly that it was better if she told him. Then he walked away toward the parking lot without another word. The air felt colder suddenly. Dad stared at Mom, waiting for an answer while she stood clutching the purse against her chest. I could see the tremor in her jaw and the way her throat tightened as she tried to speak. When she finally did, her words came out uneven. She said that the man was not just a colleague. She said he had been someone she had dated briefly before she and Dad separated years ago, and that she had recently discovered something from that time which he had wanted to discuss privately before it reached anyone else. Dad asked what that meant, but she would not say more. She just said it was personal and that she had hoped to handle it quietly, so it would not ruin the wedding. Dad's expression hardened. I could see that he did not believe her, or perhaps he did, but still hated how easily she hid it from him. He told her to open the envelope then and there if she had nothing to hide. She refused at first, then slowly unlatched her purse, pulled out the envelope, and stared at it as though it were burning her hands. When she finally opened it, the wind caught one of the papers inside and blew it against my leg. I bent to pick it up and glanced at it before she could snatch it back. It was a photocopy of a legal document, a birth certificate with a familiar last name that made my stomach lurch. It was mine. My eyes moved down the page to the section listing parents, and in the space for father there was a different name. The name of the man who had just walked away toward the parking lot. For a moment I thought the ground might give way beneath me. I felt heat rise through my body, a rush of confusion, anger, disbelief, all tangled together. Mom saw that I had read it and began to speak rapidly, saying that it was not what it looked like, that she had meant to tell me years ago, but had never found the right moment. Dad took the paper from my hand, scanned it, and then looked up at her with a hollow expression I had never seen before. He didn't shout. He didn't even ask another question. He just stared at her for a long silent moment, then turned and walked back up the path toward the reception, leaving both of us standing there in the shade by the lake. I watched him go, unable to move, unable even to breathe. Mom reached for my arm, but I stepped back. My mind was spinning too fast to make sense of anything she said. When I finally found my voice, it came out barely above a whisper. I asked if it was true, if the man who had just left was really my father. She nodded slowly, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. She said she had met him during one of the early separations before the divorce was final, and that she hadn't known she was pregnant until after things had ended. By the time she found out, she said she had already reconciled with Dad, and they had decided to raise me as his son because he loved me and wanted a family to stay whole. I turned away from her, then unable to look at her face. The world around me blurred, as though everything solid had dissolved into mist. The music from the reception had started again, louder now, and laughter drifted down the path, oblivious to the wreckage quietly unfolding behind the gazebo. I stayed by the water long after she left, standing motionless, watching the ripples spread outward from where a leaf had fallen. In the space of a few minutes, the foundation of my entire life had cracked open. My father wasn't my father. My mother had been hiding it for decades, and the man I had seen only twice now carried a piece of truth about who I was. I thought about the anonymous message on my phone and realized it had probably come from him, a final attempt to tell me himself before handing the truth to my mother. When I finally returned to the reception, the sun had dipped low, casting gold across the lawn. I could see Dad standing alone near the edge of the crowd, his face expressionless as guests clinked glasses around him. Emma and her husband were dancing in the center, blissfully unaware. I walked toward him slowly, unsure of what to say. As he turned and saw me, his eyes softened just a little, and he nodded toward the empty seat beside him. He didn't mention what had happened. He didn't need to. The silence between us carried more weight than any words could. That was the moment I realized the truth might destroy what little remained of our family if we let it. And yet, hiding it again was no longer an option. I sat beside him, staring out at the fading light, wondering what tomorrow would look like now that everything I thought I knew about myself had changed. That night, after the reception ended, I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets while the rain began to fall in light, uneven drops across the windshield like faint percussion. The city was empty save for the occasional car gliding through intersections under blinking yellow lights. I had taken off my tie hours earlier and tossed it on the passenger seat, yet the knot that had formed in my chest still tightened with each breath. Every image from the afternoon replayed in my head in jagged loops. The look on Dad's face when he saw the document, the sound of Mom's voice breaking the instant she confessed, and that single word father written beside a name I had never spoken aloud before. I ended up parking near the old pier that stretched out into the lake where we used to come as kids to feed ducks and skip stones. The rain had turned steady now, streaking the windshield with long glistening trails. I turned off the engine and sat listening to the patter of water against glass, trying to find some logic in what had happened. Part of me wanted to call Dad and explain that I hadn't known either, that I was as blindsided as he was. Another part wanted to call Mom and demand the full story, the timeline, every detail that she had kept buried all these years. Yet I did neither. Instead, I sat there staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror and wondered who exactly was looking back at me. I thought about the man in the dark suit, the one who had handed her the envelope, and how he had looked at me with a strange mix of pity and recognition before leaving. If he truly was my biological father, why show up now of all times? Why not years ago when I was still a child, when the truth might have had a chance to settle into something less explosive? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages again, reading the first one over and over until the words blurred. Whoever he was, he had tried to warn me, though his method felt cruelly indirect. Around midnight, I finally drove home. The streets shimmered beneath the streetlights, and everything smelled faintly of wet pavement and autumn leaves. When I entered my apartment, I found a voicemail waiting from Mom's number. Her voice was shaky as she said she knew she had hurt everyone, but that she had thought keeping the secret had been the kindest thing to do. She said she was terrified of losing me and begged me to understand that the man who had appeared at the wedding was not trying to claim anything, just trying to give closure. I deleted the message halfway through, unable to listen to the word closure again. The next morning my phone rang early. It was Dad. His tone was calm but hollow, as if he had aged overnight. He asked if we could meet for breakfast somewhere quiet, so I drove to a diner on the edge of town where we used to stop on road trips when I was a kid. He was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a mug of coffee untouched. When I sat down, he looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He said he had spent most of the night thinking not about Mom but about me, about whether everything between us had been built on a lie. Then he shook his head slowly and said that whatever blood might say he had raised me, he had been there for every scraped knee, every broken bike chain, every graduation, and that was what fatherhood really meant. His words hit harder than I expected because I could hear the effort it took for him to say them. I wanted to tell him how sorry I was that he had to find out that way, but he stopped me with a small wave of his hand. He said it wasn't my fault and that some truths simply have bad timing. Then he asked if I had spoken to Mom. I said no. He nodded as though that answer confirmed something for him. After a long silence, he said he wasn't sure he could ever forgive her, but he didn't want me to get caught in the crossfire. He said the worst thing I could do was let their mistakes define how I saw myself. He reached across the table and patted my hand once before standing to leave. When he walked out of the diner, I sat there for a while, watching the steam fade from his abandoned coffee. His calm had been so measured that it almost frightened me more than anger would have. I paid the check and stepped outside into the pale sunlight. Across the street, a black sedan was parked by the curb, and through the windshield I saw the outline of the man from the wedding sitting behind the wheel watching me. My pulse jumped. For a moment we locked eyes through the glass, and he raised one hand slightly, as if acknowledging me before starting the engine and pulling away. I stood there on the sidewalk watching the car disappear around the corner, unsure whether to feel fear or relief. Something told me that whatever unfinished conversation he and Mom had started was far from over. Later that day, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line simply read, "I owe you the truth." There was an attachment labeled "Letter." PDF. I hesitated for nearly an hour before opening it. The document was a long letter written in plain, measured sentences explaining everything. He said he had met my mother during a conference in another city long before her divorce was final, and that their brief affair had ended abruptly when she returned home to reconcile with her husband. He claimed he had only learned about my existence a year ago, when an old mutual friend mentioned that my birth date lined up with the time they had been together. He wrote that he had tried reaching out quietly, but she begged him to stay away, saying the truth would destroy her family. He said that when he realized she still hadn't told anyone, he decided to confront her at the wedding, knowing it might be his last chance, because he had recently been diagnosed with a serious illness that left him little time. He ended the letter by saying he didn't expect me to forgive either of them, but hoped I would at least know where I came from. He left a phone number at the bottom. I sat there staring at the number for a long time. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the sheer weight of possibility. If I called it, I might finally have answers about half of my identity that I'd never questioned until 2 days ago. If I didn't call it, the mystery would linger forever unresolved. That evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of violet, I stood by my apartment window holding the phone ready to dial. My reflection stared back at me, a face that now carried 2 histories instead of one. The air felt thick with the gravity of the choice I was about to make. Just as my thumb hovered over the call button, the screen lit up with an incoming call from that same number. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. The voice on the other end of the line was softer than I expected, older too, with a faint rasp that hinted at cigarettes or perhaps just age. He said my name quietly, as though testing how it felt to speak it aloud. For a moment I could not respond. I stood near the window staring out at the faint glow of the streetlights scattered across the wet pavement until finally I managed to say, "Yes, this is Ryan." He exhaled heavily, a sound that carried both relief and hesitation. He said he had not been sure I would answer and that if I preferred he would hang up. I told him no, that after everything that had happened I needed to hear the rest. He began slowly explaining how he had watched from a distance over the years, keeping tabs without interfering because he had promised my mother he would never disrupt our family. He said he respected my father for raising me and that for a long time he believed it was best to stay invisible. Then a few months ago he had learned about his illness and realized that if he died without ever speaking to me, he would regret it for the rest of whatever time he had left. He said the letter had been his attempt to prepare me, but that seeing me in person at the wedding had been both harder and more meaningful than he had imagined. I listened in silence, letting the rhythm of his words fill the room. There was no dramatic confession, no desperate plea for forgiveness, just a quiet sincerity that felt oddly disarming. He said he was staying at a hotel near the marina for another day before heading back to his city, and that if I wanted to meet him he would be there until noon tomorrow. He promised he would not pressure me if I declined. After he hung up, I stood there for a long while, holding the phone against my chest and listening to the faint echo of his voice still circling in my mind. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept picturing his face by the water, his hand passing the envelope to my mother, the quiet guilt in his eyes. Around 4 in the morning I finally decided that, if I didn't meet him now, I never would. When the sun began to rise, I dressed in jeans and a jacket and drove to the marina. The early light spilled across the water, turning it silver. Boats rocked gently against their moorings and gulls called somewhere in the distance. The hotel was small and old-fashioned, with a narrow lobby that smelled faintly of cedar. The receptionist pointed me to the cafe at the back, where he was waiting by a window overlooking the docks. He stood when he saw me and extended his hand. His grip was firm, though I could feel the tremor of age in it. His hair was mostly gray, his eyes the same shade of green as mine, a detail that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. We sat for nearly 2 hours. He told me about his life, a career that had taken him around the world and left him with more solitude than he cared for. He spoke about the conference where he had met my mother, about how brief their time together had been and how quickly it had ended. He admitted he had thought of reaching out sooner many times, but every attempt felt wrong. As he spoke, I found myself studying his gestures, the way he tapped the edge of his coffee cup when thinking, the slight tilt of his head when listening. Small habits that echoed my own in ways that startled me. When he paused, he asked about me, about my childhood, my work, my interests. I told him about my career, my apartment, my sister's wedding, though I left out the chaos that had followed. He listened attentively, his eyes glimmering with something between pride and sorrow. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said he knew the truth would likely drive a wedge between my parents and that he had wrestled for weeks over whether revealing it was the right thing to do. He said that secrecy might have protected them, but it had also stolen something from me, the chance to know my full story. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me agreed with him, and yet another part wished he had kept silent a little longer. He seemed to sense my conflict and said quietly that he wasn't looking to replace anyone. He just wanted me to know that I came from more than one chapter and that whatever I decided about him, he would respect it. He handed me a small envelope across the table and said it contained photographs of his family, so I would have faces to go with the name. I took it without opening it and thanked him, though my voice barely carried. When I finally left the cafe, the air outside felt cleaner somehow, though heavier too. I stood by the railing watching the sunlight ripple across the water and tried to make sense of the tangle of loyalty and identity inside me. For the first time in my life, I could see pieces of myself mirrored in 2 men who had never met. One had raised me, taught me patience and responsibility and love without conditions. The other had given me a name written quietly on a document that had lain hidden for decades. Both were part of me now, whether I wanted them to be or not. That afternoon I drove to Dad's apartment. He answered the door wearing the same weary calm he had shown since the wedding. I told him I had met the man. His expression didn't change much, though his eyes flickered briefly with something that looked like relief. I told him that the man was ill and had wanted me to know the truth before it was too late. Dad nodded slowly and said that maybe that was for the best. Then he looked at me and said that nothing about biology could undo the years we had shared. We sat together for a long time, not speaking, just watching the late light spill through the blinds onto the floor. It felt like the first quiet moment our family had known in days. As I left, he told me to take care of myself and to make peace with both halves of my story if I could. That evening I opened the envelope the man had given me. Inside were several faded photographs. One of him in his 20s standing beside an old car, one of a woman I guessed was his sister, and one of a child about my age smiling at the camera holding a toy sailboat. On the back of that photo he had written a short note. For the days you want to remember that truth can hurt and still be a gift. I set the pictures on my desk and stared at them until the room grew dark. I wasn't sure if I felt lighter or heavier. I only knew that the secret no longer belonged solely to the past. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether to forgive my mother, whether to tell Emma, and whether to let this truth live openly or quietly fade away. The choice felt immense yet strangely simple at the same time, because deep down I already knew I couldn't carry silence any longer. The morning light had a muted grayness that made the world seem gentler, as if the sky itself understood I needed quiet. I woke early, brewed coffee, and sat by the window while the city below stirred awake. For the first time in days my phone was silent, no calls, no messages, no reminders of the storm that had shaken everything I thought I knew. The envelope with the photographs lay on the table beside me, the edges curling slightly where I had touched them too many times. I thought about my mother and how she must have spent the past 2 nights alone replaying the disaster that had unfolded by the lake. I pictured her sitting at her kitchen table with her hands folded over the same purse that had held the secret all these years. I wondered if she was waiting for me to call, or if she had already accepted that some silences cannot be filled so easily. By mid-morning I decided to see her. I drove across town through light drizzle that blurred the world into soft shapes. When I reached her house, the porch light was still on, though the day was already bright enough not to need it. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she had been standing there listening for my car. She looked tired, in that way people look when sleep has done them no good. We sat in the living room where the air smelled faintly of the lilac candles she always burned. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then she said she was sorry in a voice so small I almost didn't hear it. She said she had convinced herself she was protecting everyone by keeping the truth buried, that she thought love and stability mattered more than honesty. She said that she had loved my father and that raising me together had been the best years of her life, but that the guilt never left her. Every birthday, every school event, every photograph on the wall had been shadowed by the fear that one day it would all come out. I asked why now. She said the man had contacted her months ago, insisting he needed to see her before his illness grew worse. She had refused until the wedding week, when he arrived unannounced and begged for a few minutes of her time. She swore she never meant for me or Dad to find out that way. She started crying then, in quiet, restrained sobs that felt heavier than shouting. I wanted to be angry, but what I mostly felt was exhaustion. I told her that Dad knew she was sorry, even if he could not say it yet. I told her that I had met the man, and that he seemed at peace now that the truth was finally spoken. She nodded slowly, pressing a tissue against her eyes, and whispered that maybe that was enough. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking not about secrets, but about ordinary things, the kind of gentle details families forget to notice. She asked about my work, and I told her about the upcoming project I'd been neglecting. I asked about Emma, and she smiled, saying my sister had called that morning from her honeymoon, already planning to send pictures of sunsets. When I finally stood to leave, she hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years I felt that old familiar warmth that had been missing since before the divorce. Driving home I felt lighter, though not in a triumphant way, more like a burden had simply settled into its rightful place instead of pressing down on me. When I reached my apartment, the sky had cleared. The lake beyond the buildings shimmered faintly in the distance. I sat on the balcony watching the water change colors as the sun sank. I thought about both men. My father, who had raised me with patience, and the other who had given me his eyes and his handwriting. I thought about how strange it was that truth could break something and mend something at the same time. Later that evening Dad called. His voice sounded steadier. He said he had spoken with Mom briefly, and that while forgiveness would take time, he was relieved everything was finally in the open. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said families survive not because they avoid pain but because they decide which pieces are worth rebuilding. He asked if I wanted to meet for dinner that weekend, maybe invite Mom too, just to talk like normal people again. I said yes before I even thought about it. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time listening to the hum of the city. The air smelled faintly of rain and distant barbecue smoke from the park across the street. For the first time since the wedding, I felt the world settle back into motion. The truth had changed everything yet somehow left the essential parts intact. Before bed, I took the photographs from the table and placed them in a wooden box along with the tie clip I had given Dad. 2 tokens from 2 fathers, each representing a different kind of inheritance. I closed the lid gently and slid it into the drawer where someday I might show it to my own children if I ever have any. Not as a story of betrayal, but as proof that families can fracture and still find their way back to something resembling love. As I turned off the light, I looked once more out the window at the quiet street below. The night felt clear and untroubled, and I realized that peace does not always come from answers but from accepting the questions we can live with.